Welcome to Digital Fridays, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about access pedagogy. This Digital Fridays is going to be facilitated by Jessie Rice Evans. I just want to give a quick overview of who Jessie is. Her pronouns are she, her, and hers. Jessie is a white neuroqueer femme and Southern poet based in New York City, where she works as a Digital Pedagogy Fellow with OpenLab at City Tech and a Web Development and Documentation Fellow with the CUNY Humanities Alliance. You can read some of her work inside of Entropy, WUSSY, Visible Pedagogy, Nat, Brut, and many others. Her debut poetry collection, The Uninhabitable, is now available from Sibling Rivalry Press. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jessie.
Thank you so much, Adashima.
No problem.
Appreciate you. Hi, everyone. I haven't looked to see how many people are here because that's going to make me anxious. But hello. I wanted to say before we get started that I've tried to keep things pretty simple today, but I really want to encourage folks to jump in if you have questions, if you need something cleared up, or you want to offer a suggestion or anything like that. Please feel free to do that. And you can do that by using the chat feature in Zoom. And Adashima has graciously agreed to keep an eye on that and to let me know if anyone wants to share anything or have a question answered. Whenever you want to jump in, please feel free. I really want this to be kind of informal, peer-to-peer kind of space. So with that said, good afternoon. Thank goodness it's Friday. I don't know about y'all, but I'm ready for the semester to be over, just so that I can be in bed for a few more days. So thank you so much for joining us for Access Pedagogy. Really what I want to talk about today is some of our preconceived notions about what students come into the classroom with in terms of skills, knowledge, abilities, and I really want to talk through some strategies for potentially pushing back against some of the inaccessibility of higher education. So to share a few framing questions with you, these are just ideas that I've kept with me as I am thinking through this topic of access pedagogy in my own work as a teacher, as a facilitator, as someone studying rhetoric and composition or writing studies, which is really focused on courses like first year writing, which is kind of a gatekeeping course for higher ed. Most, if not all, students are required to pass through a first year writing course or test out of one as they're moving into higher education contexts. So one of the big things that I'm always trying to think about in my writing pedagogy especially is really, as a teacher of a gatekeeping course, a course that's intended, has functioned and continues to function as kind of a way to weed out certain kinds of language as appropriate or inappropriate for the academy. What are some ways that I can center access and center disability justice in my own teaching? It's been a benefit that I'm disabled myself and have developed chronic illness over the last few years. All of this has really impacted how I approach my own teaching. For myself, my own abilities have really shifted around in terms of what I'm capable of doing. Adashima and I were just chatting before the event got started about remote working as a PhD student and how just a little more flexibility from institutions for instructors can open up a lot of possibilities for people who maybe can't be in a physical classroom 2 days a week, but are still educators working on pedagogy and trying to figure out the best way to serve students. So these framing questions, I'll read them aloud for you. how do institutional resources support or complicate working towards equitable opportunities for disabled students? Thinking there about disability service offices, what are the guidelines for students to get accommodations? There's often a setup for undergraduate students to request accommodations through a disability services office on campus, but there's not a lot of clarity around for staff and faculty, and even for PhD students or graduate students who are kind of in the liminal space between student and employee, student and faculty, student and staff, and all these different roles that we can occupy. What do we do about dealing with accommodations, dealing with making sure that we're able to express our needs in terms of what we need for working and being scholars? So, number 2, what about disabled staff and faculty? Where do we go? Who do we ask? I'm not going to go to HR. That's never worked out well for me. So keeping that question with us of what kinds of services are in place for disabled staff and faculty, and what are the assumptions that the institution has when the only disability service office that they provide is for undergraduate students. And number 3, what implicit biases are built into expectations of classroom behavior? Thinking specifically about what Margaret Price talks a lot about in Mad at School, thinking of the example of like a student eating in class and seeming kind of out of it, and that registering as extremely uncomfortable social behavior. But that's only going by this very rigid standard of what we expect people's embodiments and behaviors to be like in these really normative spaces like a university classroom. What are we privileging when we call a student's behavior inappropriate? And what are we implicitly pushing them to be or do more like in order to fit into a more kind of normative role? So we'll take these questions with us as we walk through the next few slides. Something I wanted to acknowledge also is, for the purposes of this webinar, I really want to focus on pedagogy in the classroom, relationships between students and instructors, and that's a limited viewpoint. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about services for staff, sick and disabled staff, or for navigating other barriers in higher ed, including things like the built environment, including institutional belief in colonialism, anti-Blackness, white supremacy, capitalism, cis hetero patriarchy, and all these kinds of values that are hegemonic, and that the university is really reflecting back from the culture that we're inside of. Since we only have 45 minutes, we can't talk about all of these things. So something to keep in mind, the frame here is relatively specific. And all of these other factors are of course impacting students as well as faculty and staff's abilities to get access to the resources that we need in order to survive in these spaces. So the next 3 slides, we're going to talk about some common institutional barriers that students face. So again, thinking a lot of like the in-classroom student-instructor relationship, and thinking about what are the kinds of spaces that we ask students to navigate on their own without much support to actually get through these systems and speak in the right kinds of ways in order to get access to the resources they need. First one I really wanted to focus on was the actual official accommodations. If you go to the, often it's called like at where I went and got my master's degree at City College, at a CUNY in Harlem in New York, the disability office is called the Accessibility Office, 2 separate words, which I always found really interesting, as if ability were something you just had to like work hard enough to actually access. So just an interesting note there. I see that kind of framing and like wordplay used a lot, but the accommodations offices at college and universities require medical diagnoses and documentation from medical professionals to even start the process of requesting any type of accommodation that a student might benefit from. So in the US, in the way that the system is set up now, as far as healthcare, that requires that students have health insurance, or that they are able to pay out of pocket exorbitant amounts of money in order to get to a doctor, and the appropriate kind of doctor in order to access the right kind of diagnosis. So we know that there's a lot of barriers to being able to get private health insurance. There is Medicaid and Medicare for public options for healthcare, but many people are not eligible for those services. So private health insurance has a barrier of cost. It's often very, very expensive. Paying for the actual tests that you might need for a diagnosis, paying for the appointments, but also even just paying for your monthly coverage can be very, very expensive. If anyone's ever had to navigate health insurance issues, switching jobs or moving into a graduate student role, or just they lose your paperwork and kick you off of the plan for no reason that you can understand. Facing just paperwork issues, bureaucratic issues, administrative burdens to coverage that can be really, really difficult to navigate and stressful, and can be really alienating. And the last point I wanted to make is this whole, there's a burden of dealing with the medical system at large. As a chronically ill and disabled graduate student, a lot of my time that isn't spent on my own work and research is spent on trying to get my specialist to call me back, trying to get my doctors to speak to one another, even though they're not in the same system, because in order to get this test, I need to have 2 doctors agree that this is an important test that I need. There's no kinds of guidance for folks who are navigating these spaces, and it can be extremely difficult to get people to tell you directly what it is that you need to do, and then to be able to actually navigate those spaces and fulfill those requirements is, from personal experience, it's deeply exhausting. I'm getting my PhD in rhetoric and composition, and half the time I have no idea what the words mean that they've given to me on this paper that I have to bring to this specific office. So even just that alone, kinds of the logistical stuff of making sure that your insurance is up to date, does the doctor even take your insurance? That burden by itself is deeply exhausting and requires a lot of labor that really, I think, is invisibilized for a lot of folks who don't have to deal with chronic illness or health issues that require them to navigate the medical system in quite that way. One other barrier I wanted to talk about is tech ban. Every once in a while, the Chronicle or whoever else will have a hot take article from someone about laptops being really distracting in class. That's all okay, definitely worth having a conversation about this topic. But the first thing that comes up again and again from disabled activists and scholars who speak up about the problems with tech bans is that it immediately marks any student who has a laptop or a tablet or some other kind of device that they're using in class because of their specific accommodation needs. It immediately marks them as being disabled. They've had to go through the process of requesting the specific accommodation, and then the Disability Services Office has reached out to the professor to get it all certified and make sure it's all okay. And now they're the only person in the class with a laptop out and everyone else is barred from using it. This requires that disabled students be public about their health issues. This is not appropriate. It's a violation really of HIPAA, which is the Health Privacy Act that lets people not have to share details about their personal health information with others, because this immediately demarcates that there's something different about this student, that they have, quote, special needs that other people in the class may not have. So the student has very little agency over whether or not they are able to choose to disclose their own disability status to anyone else because it's already been done for them. Another point I want to make about tech bans is I'm always, if you can hear the siren in the background, it's because I live in Brooklyn, so apologies for that. Thanks for your patience. My neighbors are having a party too, so if you hear that, that's what's going on. One other note about tech bans, I am really in favor of figuring out ways to talk with students about using technology responsibly, finding specific apps or using devices to be able to pull up like a library website to be able to look through stuff, even pull up how you get to the databases, how you check out a book. This kind of information can be super, super handy to actually have students pull up in class. Access to information is a huge benefit of using technology in class. And I think having this conversation with students of like, there are generational differences in what our expectations are around technology use. So being open to hearing from students, I'm always curious why students are on their phone. Like if I feel like they're not engaged and they're on their phone, I want to make sure that there's nothing urgent that they're worried about. They feel like they need to be somewhere else, but they're in class. Like, oh, I've had students with family in the hospital who come to class and check their phones a lot because of that. And I'm honestly like, please just go see your family. If you're able to go see them, please go see them. You don't have to be here right now. But I also think that it's worth being open to having conversation around what's the benefit of having this incredible tool like a smartphone in your pocket all the time, in your bag. I do think it's important that we not just assume everyone has a smartphone, but also figure out ways to integrate technology into a classroom to where we have stuff available for students to use. I know there's often like budgetary issues around that, and that can be complicated and political, but trying to have like a laptop cart or even bringing your own device into class to give out to students who need to access the web but aren't able to do that from any device that they might have. I feel like that opens up a lot of possibility for what you can get done during a class session, including something we're going to talk about on the next slide. So a big hot button topic at CUNY the past few years has really been a focus on trying to lower the costs of textbooks for students. We all know how abysmal this whole process can be. Buying a brand new textbook in a STEM course especially can be $400. It can be, I mean, it's an enormous burden for a lot of people, and that ends up showing up in uncomfortable ways when like certain students don't have the textbook because they couldn't afford to buy it, which immediately marks them as like being working class, being poor, which is also like taking away a lot of their power to self-identify as any of those things. CUNY has received a lot of funding in the past few years to really develop these initiatives to cut textbook costs, including focusing a lot on open educational resources. And there's like zero textbook cost courses that students can now like search particularly for courses that are zero textbook cost designated. So a lot of OER, that's open educational resources, initiatives are really focused on some of the big kind of 101 intro gatekeeping courses, similar to first year writing. Maybe you have to take like an intro to science class, something like that. So a lot of folks are doing great work at CUNY around open educational resources, which is a great step in the right direction, I think. But there has to continually be a focus on making sure that whatever resources we're creating are really being created with access in mind. Not only access in terms of, did you include alt text? Are you making sure that the contrast and colors that you're using on the website where you're hosting your OERs is appropriate? Are you making sure everything's legible for a screen reader and it's not just like a bunch of weird symbols that a screen reader is going to yell out at the person engaging with the space? Something that's important to think about in making any kinds of these big OER projects is like making sure that access becomes a broader frame. So I'm thinking about students accessing an OER site or like an OER packet on a cell phone or on a tablet? Are we making sure that all of those spaces are still going to work from a mobile device? This has been a big conversation at CUNY as well. So there's been a lot of focus on making sure that we're developing digital tools that undergraduates can really use, because so many of them are getting onto our course websites, engaging with course websites, posting assignments and things from their cell phones, which is a really important thing to keep in mind if we're going to be thinking about access and thinking about lowering the barriers between students and higher ed. Also something to consider with making OERs or non-textbook cost, zero textbook cost courses is actually like the physical difficulty of carrying a hardback textbook around. This is not the same situation everywhere, but being based in New York City, for a lot of CUNY students, carrying a 20-pound, I don't know how much they weigh, carrying like a 20-pound hardback book with them everywhere. They're coming straight from work. They have a 3-hour commute home. So it's a huge barrier. I don't want to carry that with me all day long. For me, it's harmful to my physical body, and I don't blame anyone for not wanting to physically carry an enormous book with them every single day. So providing some alternatives for how students are able to actually access this material, I think is huge and really central and important to my own thinking about pedagogy. And it's definitely important in thinking about these broader scale initiatives as well. So now let's chat a little bit about, it's a little weird to be like sitting in my bedroom kind of talking to, I don't know who's there, and I just hear myself talking. So thanks for your patience while I'm talking out loud to myself and all of you at the same time. Thank you. I do want to talk about a few strategies for instructors. No matter how you engage with students, I think that there are ways to interact with them with an attitude of respect and non-judgment. There's kind of a cultural acceptance of talking shit about undergraduates that I'm really, really grossed out by. And something that is really important to me as a teacher is like making sure that I value my students' knowledge, I value their creativity, I value their way of thinking, and that I try to, even when I disagree with them about stuff, which absolutely happens, that I try to understand where they're coming from. I try to listen, and I don't think of myself as the expert who knows everything, and they're all just here to learn from me, and they're so lucky to get this opportunity. I consistently learn more from my students than I feel I can teach to them, and I'm extremely grateful and humbled by that all the time. So another thing in access pedagogy for me is really trying to keep this spirit of openness and a spirit of curiosity that isn't rooted in judgment and condescension and expertise and elitism. So a few things that are more practical strategies for ways to deal with access and inaccess in your classroom or in whatever context you might find yourself engaging with students. I included 5 things that I've redone in my own syllabi, in my own course planning. That have really impacted the way that I think about evaluation, that I think about assessment, that I think about how I want my classes to run. So their attendance, their due dates, participation, citation practices, and final projects. Let's start from the top and talk a little bit about how to reevaluate an attendance policy and why that might be important. Many places are you're required to take attendance. When I was teaching at City College a couple years ago, I even had the experience of a student. I had to verify one individual student's attendance record every 2 weeks using like an automated form, because her attendance at school was connected to her family receiving means-based benefits from the state. So if she didn't attend class, I was supposed to mark it down, and that could impact her whole family's ability to receive cash assistance or Medicaid or SNAP and other state benefits to support them. I found this very uncomfortable for a lot of reasons. And one of them was that I'm a white, now middle class woman being asked to surveil my students' behavior and where she was choosing to go with her body, and penalize her, like putting her like livelihood at risk if she were not able to attend my class for any kind of reason. This made me so uncomfortable, and I had already been thinking quite a lot about like what attendance really meant, why we're all really invested in assigning a grade to something like this. And I find the answers not very satisfying. One of the big questions for me when we're thinking about assigning a grade based on attendance is, what are we actually measuring there? Attendance doesn't measure if a student is doing the work, or if they're engaged with the course topics, if they're reading, if they're thinking, if they're communicating with their peers about a project that they're meant to work collaboratively on. It just literally tells me if they're in the classroom at the specific time that we're all supposed to be there or not. This, to me, doesn't indicate anything about their ability to do the classwork or think the critical thoughts or practice the critical thinking that we're working on. Because I've often found that students who are struggling with attendance and coming in late or leaving early are some of the most engaged. At CUNY, undergraduate students have adult levels of responsibilities. They're young adults. They contribute to their families monetarily with providing care for younger siblings, for children, for elderly folks in the family, for sick and disabled folks in the family. Sometimes that means they have to physically be somewhere besides my classroom. And I'm not comfortable penalizing them for making a choice to put their families, put their own life needs ahead of the needs of my ego, of them being in my classroom on time. I know it's a controversial thing to talk about, but as I've dealt with my own issues with attendance in my coursework for my PhD, if I can't come to class, it's because I'm not able to stand up that day. So, I mean, I could call an Uber, roll down the stairs to the lobby, roll into the Uber and spend $45 on a car ride to class, only to sit there suffering and unable to pay attention or engage. But instead, I've chosen to stay home, do the reading on my own, and do my best to stay in contact with my colleagues and my professor. Let's talk about due dates. I have a similar kind of ethos around this. One of the big topics lately in composition rhetoric and in any kind of like disability justice oriented pedagogy thinking is what's a way that we can be a little bit more flexible around due dates. What I always do in my classes is I ask my students, I say, I was thinking this date might be good for your first draft of your thing to be due. Does that seem reasonable? It's, 10 days away. How does everyone feel about that? Do you guys have a ton to do between now and then? Do you have exams? What's going on? And that we can have a conversation about, yeah, we all have the physics midterm the day before that's due. So maybe either bumping the due date up a couple of days or moving it back a few over another weekend or something, that can really help meet the needs of everyone who's doing the project. Due dates aren't just impacting me, they're impacting all of my students upon whom I've imposed the due dates that I've chosen based on my schedule. But all of them have schedules and needs as well. So I've actually found that it's super useful to have these conversations. I think a project will take 1 week and they inform me it's going to take them 2. And that's way more useful information to me than having everyone turn in something they're not feeling confident about, that they're feeling like is incomplete because I am really strict about my due date. This also goes for accepting late work, along the lines of what I said around an attendance policy. Accepting late work is very important. You have no idea what students might be dealing with. I've been shocked at what students have come forward and told me about in trying to let me know that they're going to be submitting something late. And I just believe in trusting them, and for every one person who it might be taking advantage of your generous policy, There's going to be 20 students who got sick at the wrong time, their kid was sick, their job kept them for a double shift, and something that was out of their control impacted their ability to do the work by the due date that you had assigned. I advocate flexibility here as well. Participation. I teach hybrid courses, and one of the big things in access pedagogy that I want to focus on a lot more is figuring out ways to disrupt the kind of normative classroom environment where students like me who like did the reading and are nerds and are sitting in the front row are going to raise their hand and talk for half the class when the instructor is asking students for engagement around a particular topic. There's always 4 or 5 students, they're going to talk, they're going to raise their hand, they're going to start conversation. That's great, they're super valuable to have in class. What a great asset to have them there. And then there are students who are really, they're going to stay quiet no matter what. That doesn't mean that they're not engaged. That doesn't mean anything about them. We have to be able to give them an opportunity to demonstrate their engagement with the topic, with the material, with their projects and what they're working on in a way other than speaking in front of extemporaneously in front of a group of strangers, which is ostensibly what the other students are at the beginning of the term. At least in my experience as teaching at CUNY, that's been the case. So there's ways to incorporate participation techniques online. I've been having students do weekly kind of check-in logs that are really informal, and they just post them to like a blog site that they are developing for my classes. And they just kind of can let me know what's up, let me know how their project is going, what work they spent a lot of time on this week, if they're feeling overwhelmed by stuff, what stuff they understand and feel really engaged with, and if they have questions about whatever's going on. This for me is how I do participation and attendance, is actually based on these weekly check-ins. So students get credit for attendance and participation, which are kind of lumped together now in my courses, for doing some kind of version of a check-in log. There's a lot of creativity and room for students to be creative with what form that ends up taking. A lot of people just choose to do kind of a traditional paragraph style, but I've also had students make a meme and write a kind of reflection response to that. I've had students make little videos. I had a few students make Instagram accounts just for my class and make do like stories where they're just recording themselves talking about a project they're working on where they're feeling stuck, things like that. A big one that I want to talk about when thinking about access specifically is talking about citation practices. So I know plagiarism is like the worst possible thing that could ever happen, and everyone is very upset. But I really want to challenge people to think a little bit more critically about this whole process and understand that it's unethical to grade students on their citation practices if you haven't spent time teaching them citation practices. If you haven't gone through with them what a paraphrase is, what a summary is, what a quotation is, and talked with them about the ethics of citation, talked with them a little bit about how academic publishing works, talked with them about how if you citing their work on a project can like go in someone's CV for their tenure file, how citation practices are our responsibility as members of a larger scholarly and intellectual community to support one another and lift up certain kinds of voices. It's not appropriate to take off 20 points for a bad MLA citation when the latest MLA format is basically a build your own citation based on the information that you're able to access. So I'm really trying to encourage people to think more critically about what they're doing around citation practices and pedagogy. Final projects are a huge component of access pedagogy as well. we have this idea that it has to be done, whatever project it is that you're doing in the course of a semester has to be done at the end of 3 months. That's just not feasible for a lot of people, for a lot of projects. And this expectation that you can put a little bow on top of the research project, usually it's like a research paper in first year writing, the final project. You put a bow on top of it, it's done, it's complete, it's perfect. That's just kind of a fantasy that we all kind of, I think, need as like a grounding tool. But I really want to push people to think a little bit more broadly about what kinds of projects we can be asking students to do. A lot of my thinking about this has really been led by my students when I want to chat with them about, here's what I'm thinking for your project. They inevitably have better ideas than I do and come up with all kinds of, one wanted to make like a pilot for a web series in 3 weeks. I was like, I've never heard of such a thing. But if this is something that you feel like you can get started on as the final project for this class, at least with like storyboarding or something, then I think it's brilliant. I think it's a great idea. Just make sure that you're like tying in themes from the course. But I could never come up with an idea of that, like that amount of work, that amount of depth of thinking and creativity without the input from students who are coming from having a lot of different interests, knowledge, skill sets, and coming in and contributing their own thinking to some of my kind of limited ideas around projects and what my expectations are and should be. So much of what I'm asking folks to really think about here and thinking about how to center access pedagogy in syllabus documents, in practical, like day-to-day classroom management stuff is really so much based on listening to students and appreciating their willingness to speak openly about things that might be hard for them to talk about or uncomfortable. But that's made a huge difference in my thinking about all of these topics, is just my willingness to listen and my ability to shut up and let my students speak. One thing I want to share with you are just a few simple resources. So I'm happy to share these brief slides with everyone. But these resources have been really invaluable for me and are pretty easily accessible for folks. They're all web sources. So as you're developing syllabi and assignments for a new semester, I would really encourage folks to take a look at some of these resources. Accessible Syllabus is really in-depth look at ways to incorporate access into your course structure from the very, very beginning, from planning stages, which is really what you have to do rather than kind of plug things in later on. It's important to think about all of these ideas from the very beginning of setting up your course. And all of the Accessible U has a lot of discussion of looking at sites on different kinds of devices, which is huge. Again, thinking about, does it work on mobile? And the UDL syllabus is also talking about universal design and learning and really focusing on incorporating access, universal design principles into your thinking about setting up the course. So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for hearing me yell about access.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Jessie. I know that I certainly learned a lot, and I have a lot to consider about how I plan to instruct the students that I teach. So I wanted to open up our chat to discussion. We have a few comments and questions that are already posted, but I also want to invite you all, if you want to just jump in and ask a question, you can simply unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you're feeling a little bit shy or you don't want to talk today, that's fine too. You can just chat your question in, and Jessie and I, Jessie will go through and answer your question. So Jessie, is it okay if we get started looking at a couple of the questions and comments that came in so far?
Definitely.
Okay, can you see the group chat or should I just read it for you?
Yeah, I just pulled it up.
Okay, so I'll give you a few moments to just look at that. And I'll invite others to make a comment or a question that you may have for Jessie. But thank you again for that presentation. So Jessie, I see you want to hear from Yanis NYC. I guess you can address that one first.
Yeah, should our evaluation in terms of content level be up to par with our highly ranked schools, or should it be relative to the level of our specific cohort of students? That's a great question. I think the only person I'm ever measuring my students against, oh, I even hate the way I phrased that. I'm only ever comparing my students' work to their work, their own work. So especially with a writing class, because so much of what we do is focused on scaffolding, assignments over a couple of months, working through like the writing process towards something that's longer or more fully researched or more fleshed out, whatever it is that we're asking students to do. It's really only ever about looking at what they've done and their ability to talk to you about why they've done what they've done. I think one thing that I didn't mention in the slideshow that I should have is the importance of regular reflection practice, especially in writing and humanities courses, having students engage with their own processes and talk through a little bit of why they made the choices that they made, and working on a particular project reveals a huge amount about how well they're able to understand some of the concepts that we're talking about in the class, what they might be getting out of like working with other students in the class as like a peer reviewer, peer mentor kind of relationship. But I know it's hard to not compare, this student is so different from that other student. But I think especially when looking at something like writing, something like critical thinking and humanities especially, every student has to be looked at individually. Does that make sense, Yanis NYC? Awesome, thank you. This next question too, wondering how we consider participation for students who are still struggling with speaking English and may not be comfortable participating. This is a huge one, especially for folks at CUNY, where many of our students speak loads and loads of different languages. One student I was like just trying to get to know them a little bit, and one said he spoke 7 languages. I was like, stop it, this is crazy. So in a lot of ways, we have so much to learn from and benefit from by having students who speak so many different languages and write in so many different languages in our classes. But yeah, there is a question of like, I'm teaching in English, that's my primary language. I'm teaching about writing in English. And how do you is there a way to make students who might feel uncomfortable speaking verbally feel safer or feel more comfortable? I think this is why my participation has shifted so much from a speaking out loud in class to a writing focused, or like a little bit more student directed focus on what participation really looks like for each student. Because again, I have a lot of students who are more comfortable in doing a written form where it's a little bit more formal. They feel like they maybe have more of a skill set in that area. They focused a lot more on that in their own education. And so that's a better way for them to communicate to me that they maybe feel less self-conscious about. The other thing that comes up with working with students who are English language learning is there's often a lot of, they're carrying with them a lot of racism from teachers and maybe even other students who have picked on them for their accent, or picked on them for not being able to, like, not knowing this word or another word. So like acknowledging the trauma of those experiences by just kind of letting students be where they are, and not jumping in to correct them is a good practice.
Thank you for that, Jessie. So we have another question here from Ali.
Yeah, one question: sometimes we perceive technology as a solution to accessibility problems, but there's also an ugly reality that technology also creates a barrier for students from underrepresented groups. What do you think about that? That's a huge, important point, Ali, and I'm glad that you brought that up. One of the big challenges, I think I mentioned this earlier a little bit, but one of the big assumptions that is a problem is assuming that, oh, you can go home on your laptop and do your project with your expensive software that you have on your personal laptop, when that's absolutely not the case for a lot of students, depending on their backgrounds. I think that at least there seems to be more of a centering of getting technology onto campuses and trying to figure out ways to get it into the hands of students. For some places, that's like a primary goal, and a lot of CUNYs have done a lot of work and spent a lot of money, frankly, on making technology a lot more accessible to students in class. It's a tricky one, though, because we make a lot of assumptions about, oh, you're going to be able to use this website that I like just fine, when in actuality, they don't have alt text for any of their images, or there's no captions for any videos. So it's really tricky. And I think one of the hardest parts about doing this kind of labor is like acknowledging that we're falling short in a lot of areas, and we're leaving a lot of people out, and we're trying to, it's not something that one person can solve by themselves, and we're going to just try to do our best to serve folks regardless. And that means listening to students and advocating like hell for them to get their hands on whatever resources they feel like they need to succeed.
And then I see one last question here, and then we're out of time.
Okay, from Janelle. Wondering how to help new, sometimes young graduate instructors who are often anxious and uncertain about their own authority in the classroom successfully build accessible policies. Asking, as someone who mentors these new instructors and sees a lot of these anxieties playing out, even as they so want to work on building kind, accessible, inclusive pedagogies. Yeah, that's a great question, Janelle. One of the thing is, like, we're not, like, to students, we as graduate teaching instructors or as adjuncts are like, we're authority figures in relationship to them, but it's hard to see ourselves that way when we're part-time. We're like left out of department meetings, kind of like on the margins from everyone in their full-time gig, as we're like commuting to.
You're coming in a little bit muffled.
I'm so sorry.
Now we can hear you. Can you repeat what you said? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it can be challenging for graduate students to navigate that kind of interstitial space between being a student, being an instructor. To your undergraduate students, you're always an authority figure, and you're always someone who has way more access than they do to these institutional spaces and powers. But you're also kind of you don't have a lot of resources at your disposal. So, I mean, I think one of the big things with new instructors is really encouraging them to trust their students and to be curious about their students. And what that means a lot of times is being able to acknowledge that if they don't know something, there's no need to, you don't know everything, nobody does, and that's okay. So I think that there's like a lot of pressure for graduate students to feel like we have to say we know everything. But that's one of the best things about being an educator is we don't, and we have a lot to learn, and we're in this space to try to do better and learn more ourselves. I don't know if that answers your question, Janelle, but thank you for asking it. Okay, thanks.
So with that, we are out of time. I want to thank Jessie for presenting this fascinating webinar once again. So all of the Digital Fridays are recorded unless there is an objection by the facilitator. So Jessie has agreed to let us record this one. So you'll be able to find this, a recap of this Digital Fridays, and hopefully Jessie will delight us in writing a recap of this webinar as well, and we'll post everything on HASTAC. So thank you again, everyone. I hope that you have a great holiday and a great new year. If you have any questions about anything, please feel free to email me. If you have a question specific to Jessie, please reach out to Jessie as well on HASTAC Scholars. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, y'all.